Welcome to the Herstory Circle podcast, the podcast that brings you the extraordinary tales of everyday women who are changing the world. I'm your host, Gertrude Mache, and I'd like to acknowledge traditional custodians of the land on which we meet today. I also like to pay my respects to elders, past, present, and emerging. Every week, we dive into the lives, challenges, and triumphs of women from all four corners of the globe. We're here to inspire, enlighten, and connect, sharing stories that uplift and empower. So grab a cup of coffee, settle in, and join us as we explore the incredible journeys of women shaping our future. This is Her Story, where every woman's voice matters. Hello, everybody, and welcome back to the Her Story Circle. This is Gertrude Mache here in beautiful Melbourne, Australia. And today I am graced with the presence of yet another fascinating woman. Welcome, welcome, welcome to our tribe. Please tell everybody your full name, where you're based, and share your story with us today.
Salam, shalom. Hi, everyone. My name is Sarah. I'm currently recording on the lands of the Bunurong and Bunurong people, the traditional custodians of Kulin lands. My name is Sarah, and it can also be translated as princess in Hebrew. But some people also know me as Nyagwa, which is a South Sudanese name, which means kind and beautiful girl. So I have a picture today with me of little Nyagwa, as I've recently turned 40, and this is a perfect opportunity to share a bit of my story, what makes me unique, and hopefully it has some inspiration to some of you in the world. I also celebrated the fact that I got a PhD recently, so you'll have Dr. Sarah there in front, and I really want to shout out, all women who have made amazing changes in the world, and this is just one way we can do that. So today I'm going to share a little bit of my story in terms of my cultural tale, what makes me unique, the things that make up my worldview, my place in the world, but also some of the inspirations I've drawn on as being a woman and my aspirations for the future. So I'm looking forward to Gertrude asking me some questions about that story. And specifically, I work with a lot of intercultural communities across difference, but also across strengths, working with communities to explore their own self-determination and what makes them exciting in the world. So I loved Gertrude's intro, the music, that makes me excited. I recently went on a trip to Southern Africa, to Zimbabwe, where Gertrude is from, and to Botswana, actually. I actually got to explore some of my heroes. One of them is Nelson Mandela. And I'm actually inspired by a woman who wrote a speech for Nelson Mandela, Marianne Williamson. Some of you might know him as being attributed this to the speech, but she wrote that our greatest fear is not that we're inadequate, but that we are powerful beyond measure. And it is our light, not our darkness, that drives us and inspired us. Who are we to be important, talented, fabulous? But actually, who are you not to be? So I hope we take away some key storytelling today, that we all have our lights to shine. We all have our own versions of little Sarahs. And I hope that we can learn from some of these stories. So the reason why I talk about a cultural tale is because I met a uncle, Greg Morris, who's a Samoan elder. And I was actually a part of a training organization called Mahana Culture. And Greg has spent lots of time with different First Nation elders and leaders around the world. Particularly, he spent some time with Dr. Martin Brokenleg. And Martin Brokenleg is a Dakota chief or an elder from Lakota. Sorry, he's a Lakota chief from Dakota in the lands that we call America or also Turtle Island. And Dr. Martin Brokenleg suggests that we all drag a cultural tale 1,000 years long. So if you think of it, your ancestors, people from 100 years ago, 1,000 years ago, are all part of your cultural tale. These people are potentially in your DNA, and some of your stories are linked to that cultural tale, whether we like it or not. That is through blood, birth, or choice, which is what Greg has helped weave my cultural tale by understanding these three components. So, through blood, my family or ancestors came on a ship from England, and also my ancestors are from Scotland. So, this ship was called the Lady Montagu. And I think this is an important story for where I am in Australia because we often have a lot of narratives about people who come on boats and ships. And we often talk about those people as not having a sense of belonging in Australia or having a tough journey. But when I found in my family story, in the annals of the Lady Montagu, my family literally actually stole a loaf of bread. To come to Australia, they were named convicts and they were put on this ship, almost considered as criminals who had to start their new life here. So when I acknowledge the traditional custodians, I acknowledge that I'm on these lands now and I cherish this opportunity to get to know people here. So when we talk about blood, that story is not always chosen for us. This story wasn't chosen for me, but I acknowledge my ancestry that I'm on stolen lands. But through my blood story, I also have a beautiful family, actually, what I call an intercultural family. So, what I mean by that is that my auntie married a Wiradjuri man. That Wiradjuri people are from a place called Gundagai, I guess, um, in New South Wales. And so when I share my story with Gertrude's International Women's Day next week a bit more, you'll see a picture of little Sarah, not just with me with my little mousy hair and blue eyes, but my family is also First Nations peoples. So we grew up together, playing together, going on holiday, and that broadened my worldview to think about the world not just through my own white culture, through my story, my cultural tale, but through this bigger picture. So I came to know through my birth story that I was born in a country town. You could probably tell through my accent that I have this kind of Aussie accent in that regard. But I also was a part of the Salvation Army. My parents were ministers in the Salvation Army, which is sometimes known as a church, but sometimes known as a social service that's operating around the world. So, throughout my birth story, this link to the Salvation Army led me to get to know this concept of social justice. And often at our table, there were always people at the table. Sometimes there were homeless people for dinner, sometimes there were people experiencing addiction, sometimes they've just had a rough life. And so, this concept that I'm not just one person, but I'm raised in a village of people from different backgrounds became important to me. And then finally, through that birth story, I started to realize that there was this idea that another world is possible. So I had started reading Nelson Mandela, people like Gandhi, um, also some women authors, but at the time this was also available to me. I started to see that bigger picture of Martin Luther King and social justice, human rights issues. That led me to become a youth worker and community development worker. And I've spent about 20 years of my life working alongside communities, mostly from South Sudan in the last few years, as my PhD was based on young South Sudanese Australians developing their political voice to resist some of the narratives that are portrayed about them in Australia, that they're criminals and gangs and not able to integrate into Australia. Whereas I know their unique stories through art, through music, and my passion is ultimately to see people's eyes light up, that they have an inner story inside of them that's worth listening to in the world. So I bring it back to that Marianne Williamson quote, where we again reflect on this story inside of us, that our greatest fear is not that we're inadequate, but that we're powerful beyond measure. So as I reflect now that I've just turned 40, I'm also reflecting on what does that mean for my life through my blood, my birth, and my choice story. What are the choices I have now to who make me who I am? Who are the people I want to surround myself with? And how will I use this social justice in a conscience to think about where to next for my story?
Sarah, what a fascinating path you follow to be here with us today in 2024. Our origin stories are very important. The legacy of your ancestors, for you to be here to share this with us is absolutely fascinating. And, listening to you, that intersectionality that encompasses the person that you are, from where your descendants came from, who they married into, all lends to this intercultural community that we are living in, especially here in Australia. So it's really, really fascinating to hear you speak. So, can you share with us a pivotal moment in your journey that led you to your current work in intercultural community development and youth engagement?
Hmm. I think one pivotal moment was when I was living in Dandenong, which is in the southeast of Melbourne. For those of you who are around the world, Dandenong is a very multicultural suburb. There's about 235 different languages spoken, and people come to Dandenong if they're from former refugee backgrounds. So I was working at the Salvation Army at the time as a young 20-year-old, and some South Sudanese people were inviting me back to their homelands for the first time. It was semi during the civil war there. The lands weren't yet independent as what we know as Sudan and South Sudan now. And one experience I had was going to South Sudan and North Sudan. And I know that you're also influenced by this concept of Gertrude, the Ubuntu concept, the philosophical African philosophy that I am because you are. I am a
Yes.
person through other persons. So this experience of visiting South Sudan, really, this became alive to me as I was given the name Nyagwa, kind and beautiful girl, but I was also seeing other people's experiences and how they see the world. And this philosophy has carried through for the rest of my life, Ubuntu.
That is just fascinating. So, how do you approach the intersection of youth engagement and cultural diversity in all of your initiatives?
Mm. So I first like to think about community strengths, what makes them unique and who they are. And
Mhm.
sometimes that does take a bit of storytelling, a bit of conversation around even that term strength is not always translated in different languages. And so finding people's unique stories. I see myself as kind of a facilitator or someone that can weave in and out, which is a unique skill, I think. And but I also think that with that skill, acknowledging things like our biases, our worldviews, and the story that I shared is important to note. That I'm not coming into communities as saviors or trying to change or fix anyone, that I'm inherently getting to know who they are and what makes them shine, especially
Mm.
with young people. I think it's a critical time in their journey when often at school or other people are not always giving them that instilled spirit inside of them that they're important, that they matter. So I did find through hip hop was one avenue, poetry, spoken word poetry, where in
Okay.
Dandenong, where I lived, there were lots of young people who were told they don't fit in or belong. And
Mhm.
this concept of hip hop really helped them to express their voice.
Good. And it's interesting that you're meeting the youth where they're at. You are tapping into what lights them up, hip hop, dance, spoken word poetry. It's a really interesting way to appeal to the youth. So, can you elaborate on your experience working with Indigenous communities and how you integrate Indigenous inquiry in your practice?
It's a really good question. I think there's a lot of different perspectives on whether one can integrate Indigenous perspectives if they're not from a First Nations background.
Yeah.
But what Greg was sharing with me and from Dr. Martin Brokenleg is that if we recognize we have a cultural tale, that even people who identify with whiteness or white backgrounds actually also have a cultural tale. That my ancestors from England and Scotland had experiences that I needed to explore for me to understand that they were First Nations people somewhere also. It's a
Mhm.
language that we don't often really talk about. So I'm interested in that. So the way that I try to then explore that working alongside communities is to acknowledge that history, but to acknowledge those indigenous philosophies similar to Ubuntu,
Yeah.
which is actually this communal way of seeing other humans and not necessarily putting us into those categories of white, black, brown, all of these colors that we've um, been placed into through what I call critical race um, analysis, which
Mm,
is been very harmful since about the 1400s onwards, when we were categorized in terms of our skull structure, our features, and different communities were placed in a racial hierarchy. So even that concept of race was kind of created somewhat, and it
mm,
ended up benefiting people like myself, those who were from the whiteness category. And I like to um, unpack that and to reclaim this concept that our human DNA is 99.9% the same. Our
so
blood is the
true.
same. Our skin color might have a different pigment, but internally we are very similar.
So, in your view, what role does art play in fostering understanding and communication across diverse cultures?
Mm. So I just wanted to share that in that sameness, there's this idea of colorism, which means that it's very important to often acknowledge that different people have different experiences in
Mm,
society. In in particular, I have different experiences than my South Sudanese brothers and sisters, for example. So through art, I have found that people are able to share their unique story through their social context, and that's why I really liked hip hop, particularly conscious hip hop, because
mm,
the origins of hip hop in New York, in the Bronx in particular, were people who were told that they don't fit in, that they couldn't go to the discos in Manhattan, and they ended up making their own subculture, which was
mm.
pretty exciting just through starting a music kind of concert in one of the buildings in the Bronx. So I went back there in 2015 just to see like what that looked like.
And these are people who are on the fringes of a society who then create their own subculture. And now we all know about hip hop, it's mainstream. That is absolutely fascinating. Now, you mentioned a focus on South Sudan.
Mm.
Can you tell us more about your experiences and insights that were gained from working in that context?
Yeah, I think that's an interesting story because I know a lot of people often travel. And again, sometimes with that idea of saviorism, or I'm going to go to a different country and I'm going to help. And so, as a young 20-year-old, I may have had some of those concepts. I was
Mhm,
learning about the words called developing countries and things like that. I now have a different frame for how I see how we assign countries to different experiences.
mm,
But I think that experience actually helped me to see an Indigenous worldview that if I see my South Sudanese brothers and sisters as inherently human, I am because you are, then our connection, there's actually not an opportunity to walk away. So if I
Mhm.
see injustice, if I see a people group hurting, then I actually have an imperative to walk alongside and go on that journey with them for liberation and for them to determine what that means to them. And if they are liberated, then I am also liberated because of my
Mhm.
humanity is intertwined. So
I
that
love
journey has been a relational journey that still
that.
continues to today.
So, how do you navigate the complexities of power dynamics within communities and organizations, particularly in the context of pursuing systematic change?
I think that's an important one in terms of people who are developing long term relationships with communities do have an ability to work in that intertwined space. So we call it a third space. But if
Mhm.
you're there just to come in and come out, you're leaving quickly, you don't actually have an opportunity to understand what the power dynamics are. Who are the elders in the community? Who are the women often who are actually making their community run and function? And once you do build that relationship, you're able to understand the important people, but also the people whose voices haven't been listened to. Everyone has a voice. It's not that we don't need someone to tell us we have a voice, but that voice is given a space to shine. So power dynamics is something that I look at with the intercultural framework, which
Mhm.
is from an Indigenous elder in Bundjalung country, and he talks about the riverbed, which is a way that we can negotiate power dynamics. So I don't have time to really go through that framework, but
Mhm.
it's an opportunity to use Indigenous ways of being and seeing the world to understand our relationship in that space between.
Now, your philosophy emphasizes the importance of storytelling. And, when I started talking to you, I realized that you and I have a very similar passion around this particular subject.
Yes,
How do you believe storytelling contributes to social movements and transformative change?
absolutely. I think that a lot of social movements I've studied inherently have people or groups that are often small groups.
Mhm.
Often they weren't necessarily important people. It wasn't like they were assigned to this role. They have a vision or something that they see as bigger than themselves.
Mhm.
Eventually, they may have become that big figurehead. But I even look at things like the Black Lives Matter movement now, who have
Yes.
actually decided to have cells or networks to reproduce themselves around the world rather than having this movement leader who's someone that we all follow. So I think the world is changing in terms of social movements, that we
Mhm.
don't often want to now put people up on pedestals because they're going to let us down. They're human also. I'm human also. So this interconnectedness, relational leadership, I think is something that's going to head the next social movements. I particularly think of Palestinian communities at the moment and the way that art is often the only thing that people have access to when you're in such a persecuted environment.
Mm.
Reclaiming things like color, even the watermelon, making that the colors of the Palestinian flag and us now wearing those around the world is just one way.
Now, anti racism initiatives are a very significant part of your work.
Mm.
Can you share some of the strategies that you employ in addressing systemic racism and fostering inclusivity?
Mm. So I think a quick definition of anti-racism is important because it's a
Mhm.
catchword that's thrown around. So when I was sharing about the way that humans have been categorized in terms of color, that is an anti-racist way of talking about race and culture. So for me, anti-racism is understanding our history, and that helps us to then navigate the future of being with each other. So I really love Dr. Ibram Kendi's book, How to Be an Anti-Racist, on that. He says that it's not enough to be not racist, but we should all think about being anti-racist. That means
Mm.
looking at our history, looking at the ways of being with each other, but then articulating an alternate future. If we know what we don't want, what is it that we do want? And that's what I'm excited about.
Oh, I do like that. That is just beautiful. Okay, so as someone deeply committed to human rights,
Mm,
what challenges have you faced in advocating for marginalized communities, and how do you overcome them?
mm. So that brings me to my current work. I was working with young people and communities in art and hip hop. And then I became a lecturer at RMIT University last year. And this has
Mhm.
given me a platform. In terms of anti racism, one of the views is that people like myself, people who might have some element of power and privilege, that we to some extent step aside and create an equal space for others who might be coming into leadership positions. So what I found with Ibram Kendi's book, the conclusion of anti-racism approaches is to focus on policy change, how power structures have created in inequity amongst communities. So I'm working with the African Australian Advocacy Centre at the moment, who recently welcomed the United Nations Working Group of experts of people of African descent. It's a long acronym, but these
Yes.
are leaders from around the world. And it was led by Dr. Barbara Reynolds from Guyana, who came to Australia with this cohort to analyse the human rights situations of people of African descent in Australia. So there's a lot of strengths, as we know, of Africans in Australia. And actually, from the first fleet, there's a history of people being here. Whereas in our nation's history, we often talk about this recent arrival, but African people of African descent have been here for a very long time. So I guess finishing up, there are many strengths, but the human rights situation was quite desolate when this review happened. And I'll give one example to put it in context. I work with a lot of young South Sudanese in the criminal justice system, youth justice system, who had their visas cancelled and they were sent to Christmas Island indefinitely. So that means that they were supposed to get deported to South Sudan. Because of the human rights situation, they couldn't go back to South Sudan. And so they were literally on this island indefinitely. So I think human rights, this vision of Ubuntu is then carried out to some of those more advocacy and policy challenges that we face.
Sarah, thank you for your work. Thank you for being a beacon of light in this field. I just am inspired that you are working with young African people because I've seen the situation here in Australia myself. I see the need. The justice system is filled with brown bodies, and something needs to change there. So, if there
Mm,
was another young person, this is my last question, listening to this podcast who feels, I want to make a difference, I want to be like Sarah. If you could go back to the younger you and
mm,
give yourself three nuggets of wisdom based on what life has taught you up until this point, what would you have liked somebody to say to you before you started on this journey? What
mm.
have been your insights? Give us three nuggets of wisdom before we end.
So I was a country girl, as I mentioned. In my town, there's only about 2,700 people, but I had this inherent view that there's a bigger picture. But there were many people that often told me um, to be small to some extent. I said to one guest author who came to my school, I want to be a writer, I want to be an author. And they said, oh, have you really thought about that? It's a tough job. So I think many young people are often told things like that, and those narratives then become very big in their head.
Yes.
So I chose not to listen, and I eventually have got to be an author through various ways, but I didn't listen to those voices. I think specifically the second one, as women, we're often told to have specific roles in society, and some of those are good roles if that's what you choose to do. Getting married, having a house, having a family is often one journey that you could go on.
Yes.
I would love to go on that journey myself, but I also have seen that my journey has taken me on a different route, becoming a doctor, writing my thesis and my PhD. And I just wanted to share with young people that your story is valid no matter which route you take, that our roles in society are important, but they don't define us. I think, thirdly, be a young person, enjoy that time of life while you can. Life gets very serious quickly. So if you want to explore nature, if you want to think about who you are, spend that time really articulating that for yourself, whether it's through art or music or dance or sport, whatever it is that makes your eyes shine.
Sarah, thank you so much. I'm excited you're going to be one of our speakers at our first in-person summit here in Melbourne, Australia, 15th to 16th of March. Go onto our website, everybody, grab a ticket. The website is the herstorycircle.net, right underneath. Thank you again, Sarah. Absolutely wonderful to have done this interview with you. Have a fantastic weekend.
Thank
Bye
you.
for now, everybody. Thank you for tuning into the Herstory Circle podcast. I hope today's story has inspired you to believe in the power of our stories and the difference you can make in the world when you use your voice. I'm Gertrude Mache, and it's been an honor to share this space with you, where voices from all walks of life come together to weave a rich tapestry of diverse perspectives. Don't forget to subscribe, rate, and review our podcast to help us share these stories with more listeners. Follow us on social media by looking for the Herstory Circle podcast for more updates. And join us tomorrow for another episode filled with courage, resilience, and empowerment. Remember, your story matters, and together we're building a stronger, more inclusive world. Until next time,